It arrived on a Thursday. Wedged between a grocery store coupon booklet and a routine electric bill was a cream-colored envelope, thicker than the others, hand-addressed and instantly recognizable. My mother's handwriting hadn't changed in 5 years. The same narrow slant, the same deliberate loops. Even before I turned it over, my fingers went cold. I didn't open it right away. Instead, I placed it on the kitchen table and busied myself with small, senseless rituals, wiping down a spotless countertop, refolding the throw on my reading chair, straightening the already aligned picture frame on the wall. But no matter how I tried to distract myself, that envelope seemed to breathe. It pulsed in the corner of my vision, as if it had its own quiet rhythm. My apartment, as always, was still, clean, predictable. The pot of Earl Grey I'd steeped 20 minutes earlier had gone tepid beside my unopened laptop. Through the window, golden sunlight filtered through the maples outside, their leaves just beginning to crisp and color for fall. I usually love this time of year in Charlottesville. The air turned honest. But that envelope made it hard to breathe. Eventually, I sat down. The paper was thick, elegant, formal. It was, as I expected, a wedding invitation. Caleb Reid and Andrea Sullivan request the honor of your presence. My younger brother's name in block print made my stomach clench in ways I thought I'd outgrown. They hadn't even tried to sound personal. It could have gone to anyone. But tucked inside, folded twice and written in smaller, shakier script, was a separate note. Please come. I miss you. Mom, I read it once, then again, and again. Her message took up just 7 words, but somehow it said both too little and far too much. I pressed the card flat against the table with my palm and closed my eyes. Instantly, I was back at Thanksgiving 2016. Jessica, in a wine-red blouse and too much perfume, raised her glass with a smirk and said, "To a family unburdened by disappointment." No one flinched. No one contradicted her. Not Dad, not Caleb, and definitely not Mom. That was the moment something inside me sealed shut. I stood up, left the dinner uneaten, and never looked back. Well, until now. I got up and walked to my desk, pulled open the bottom drawer. Beneath old court notes, a cracked leather-bound journal, and a Bar Association newsletter I kept meaning to recycle, lay another envelope. This one yellowed slightly with time, edges still sealed. My grandfather had given it to me the day I walked away from my medical residency. "When the time comes," he'd said, placing it gently in my palm, "you'll know." I hadn't opened it. I hadn't needed to. I always suspected what it said, or feared it did. I held it now, the 2 envelopes side by side on the kitchen table. One from the past, one from the people who had tried to erase me from theirs. I wasn't the prodigal child. I didn't leave to chase chaos. I left because I couldn't keep suffocating in a story someone else had written for me. The robe hanging by the front door wasn't just ceremonial, it was who I'd become. Monica Reid, district judge. I'd built a life from the very silence they left me in. I'd bought this apartment on my own, put myself through law school, bar prep, and years of clerking. My name was on real estate contracts, court briefings, professional panels, but it wasn't in my family's annual holiday newsletter or framed in the hallway alongside Caleb's surgical residency photos. To them, I was a shadow they'd quietly redacted. My phone buzzed. A message lit up the screen. "Maya, please tell me you got it." Another ping. "You better go. And wear that green dress, the one that says, 'I win without trying.'" I laughed. Maya never minced words. She'd seen me at my lowest, eating cereal on the floor of a studio apartment while grading mock trial papers late at night. She knew what it cost to cut family loose and what it meant to keep going anyway. Still holding the letter from my mother, I leaned against the window pane. The sunlight caught the edge of the frame that held my favorite picture. Me and Grandpa William standing in front of the old courthouse steps, my law school diploma barely visible as he beamed like I'd won the Nobel Prize. "Some cages are lined with gold, Monica," he used to say, "but they're still cages. You were born to break them." I walked back to the kitchen and opened my laptop. The RSVP portal was standard, impersonal. A drop-down menu with 2 options: accept, decline. My fingers hovered, then moved. I typed in my name, clicked accept. Then, just below, in the space for additional comments, I wrote, "I'll be there." Click, sent. There was no dramatic swell of music, no rush of vindication, just the soft whoosh of an email traveling through cyberspace, and the steady beat of my heart trying to catch up with itself. I placed my grandfather's letter beside the robe hanging near the door. Maybe I'd open it the morning of the we. Andrea led me into the sitting room where Jessica stood near the fireplace in cream slacks and a pale blue blouse, arms folded like she was keeping gravity in check. Her smile when she saw me was practiced. "You made it." "So it seems," I replied. Jessica's eyes scanned my outfit. Black turtleneck, slate coat, and ankle boots. Classic, not flashy. Her mouth twitched. "You're just here for the ceremony, I assume." I opened my mouth, then closed it. There was no right answer, so I simply nodded. Andrea, still oblivious, smiled at Jessica. "Did you know Monica is the one who wrote the majority opinion in Hartley versus Monroe County? The one we've been citing all year?" Jessica blinked, her posture faltering half a breath. "Of course," she said tightly. "We've all read the papers." The silence that followed said more than it meant to. "Your room's upstairs," she added. "Or what used to be your room. It's sort of a linen overflow now." I wanted to laugh, but my throat wouldn't cooperate. "I'll find it," I said. Andrea gave my shoulder a squeeze. "If you need anything, just holler. I'm so happy you're here." And then she was gone, charming someone else, managing some other detail, leaving me standing in the middle of the room like a misplaced piece of furniture. I climbed the stairs slowly. The hall smelled like citrus polish and distant nostalgia. My old room had been stripped of personality. Bed gone, replaced with garment racks and crates labeled reception and mother of the groom accessories. A single folding cot had been made up in the corner. I sat on its edge, letting the silence settle. A soft knock came a few minutes later. My mother poked her head in, eyes weary but gentle. Please don't make a scene, okay?" I nodded. That was never the plan. She lingered in the doorway a moment longer, as if she wanted to say something else, then quietly disappeared. I changed into a dark green dress, yes, the one Maya had insisted on, and joined the gathering crowd on the lawn for the welcome toast. Waiters passed hors d'oeuvres. Guests sipped white wine and complimented the weather as if it had been special ordered. Andrea stood beneath the largest tent, clipboard now gone, replaced by a champagne flute. She raised it lightly and smiled. "I just want to take a second to thank someone I truly admire," she said, scanning the crowd. "She doesn't know I'm doing this, but Monica Reid, your work in housing law has inspired more young advocates than you probably realize." Heads turned. I froze. Murmurs rippled through the guests. A few recognized the name. Others just followed the eyes. Jessica's expression didn't change, but something behind her gaze flickered. "I mean it," Andrea said, beaming. "You remind me so much of my favorite law professor. He always said to cite Judge Reid whenever possible." Applause followed, hesitant at first, then polite. I smiled, nodded once, and raised my glass slightly. I couldn't tell if my cheeks were flushed from emotion or the wine, maybe both. No one clapped harder than Andrea. She still had no idea. The photo album sat on the desk in my makeshift guest room, its worn leather cover faded to a soft gray. I hadn't meant to open it. I was just looking for a pen. But once my fingers brushed the edge of the spine, muscle memory took over. I used to spend hours flipping through these pages as a child, imagining a life even more golden than the photographs captured. This time, the story was different. There were the usual spreads, summer vacations, science fairs, Thanksgiving dinners arranged with surgical precision, but some pages looked tampered with. One had the imprint of a photo long gone, its corners still taped down. Another showed a family trip to Cape Cod. Only now, there were 5 people at the beach, not 6. The spot where I'd once stood between Caleb and our grandfather had been cropped, cleanly. Then there was the Christmas page. The photo was intact, technically, but I had been placed off to the side, half shadowed, half forgotten, like a guest captured by accident. I closed the album carefully and placed it back where I found it. For a few long seconds, I just sat there in the stillness, staring at the whitewashed walls and stiff beige armchair. The entire room had been repurposed into an afterthought, an empty cot, a half-unpacked box labeled reception candles. No trace that I'd ever grown up here. That evening, after the crowd had dispersed and the final tent lights were dimmed, I slipped on a coat and walked toward the back of the estate. Past the swing set we'd long outgrown, past the rose bushes my mother still trimmed with military resolve, all the way down to the pond. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the bare-limbed trees above. I sat on a weathered bench, the one my grandfather had favored when he needed quiet. I used to join him here after school. He'd hand me a caramel wrapped in wax paper and ask what I'd learned that day. When I told him I wanted to become a lawyer instead of a doctor, he didn't argue. He just nodded and said, "Good. The world needs defenders." I pulled out my journal from my coat pocket and unfolded the fragile half-letter I'd tucked inside years ago. It had torn in my bag during my last year of law school, but the message was still legible in Grandpa William's spidery hand. "Some people serve best by healing bodies," it read. "But you, Monica, you were always meant to protect what lives beyond the body, justice, truth, and people no one else hears." I folded it back with care. When I returned to the house, the porch light had been left on. My mother's subtle way of saying, "I know you still belong here," even if no one says it out loud. The next morning, the brunch table stretched longer than necessary across the dining room. Crisp linens, perfectly arranged mimosas, and polite conversation coated in static. I sat at the far end next to a window that overlooked the garden. Caleb was 3 seats away, buried in small talk with one of Andrea's cousins. Jessica floated between groups like a cruise director, avoiding my gaze. Only Andrea seemed truly at ease. She sat beside me with a generous scoop of fruit salad and a cup of black coffee. Her curls were still damp from the morning shower, and she wore a soft blue sweater that made her eyes seem even brighter. "You sleep okay?" she asked. I nodded. "As well as one can in a storage room filled with lanterns and chair covers." She laughed. "Sorry about that. Jessica was in charge of room assignments. I should have known she'd convert something into event support." Andrea bit into a strawberry, then sipped her coffee. Her expression shifted, like something had been nagging her all night. "So, I hope this isn't a weird question," she said, her voice casual. "How do you know the Reids? I mean, clearly you know them, but no one said exactly how." My fork paused halfway to my mouth. I set it down gently, turned toward her, and offered a smile that felt as sharp as it did polite. "I'm Caleb's sister," I said. "Jessica's too. Just not the kind they tell stories about." Andrea froze, her coffee cup hovering midair. She blinked. "Wait," she whispered. "What?" She stared at me like she was trying to rewind every conversation she'd had over the past year and retranslate it. I watched the understanding land slowly, piece by piece, and didn't move. Behind us, Jessica's voice rose in practiced laughter. Caleb murmured something to the cousin across from him. But here, in the middle of her own wedding brunch, Andrea Sullivan had just realized she didn't know who her future sister-in-law was, or why no one had told her. Andrea raised her glass and said, "Judge Reid has changed lives." The world paused. Forks stilled midair, glasses hovered in hands, and a low violin phrase halted on a single long note. The tent glowed golden in the twilight, casting long shadows that suddenly felt much heavier. I sat near the bar at the outer edge of the dinner, intentionally placed where no one had to acknowledge me. The table settings gleamed, tiny copper pumpkins, folded ivory napkins, the scent of roasted squash and cinnamon drifting in waves from the buffet, and now this, my name, said aloud like a bell rung in a cathedral. Andrea stood tall in her forest green dress, cheeks flushed from wine and excitement. "I just have to take a second," she said brightly, "to thank someone I truly admire." She turned and looked straight at me. "Judge Monica Reid, your work in housing equity law changed the entire way I think about advocacy. Your opinion in the Hartley decision, it's required reading where I work. You reminded me that law isn't just for boardrooms, it's for people." Some polite clapping started near the wedding party table. One of Andrea's colleagues nodded slowly. My mother looked suddenly very alert. Jessica, seated rigidly at the head of the table, didn't blink. I lowered my gaze to my champagne flute, watching the bubbles gather and rise. I hadn't touched it. I rarely drank at family functions. Old habit. Andrea continued, oblivious. "I just found it so wild that someone I've looked up to professionally is actually here. So, how do you know the Reids? Or is this just one of those magical coincidences?" I looked up. My mother's face, half lit in the glow of a hanging bulb, seemed to plead without words. Caleb was stone-faced, his knuckles whitening on his fork. Jessica's jaw twitched with fury she hadn't yet found words for. My grandfather once said, "The truth has terrible timing. It shows up when people least want it and exactly when they need it most." I took a breath. "I'm Caleb's sister," I said, voice even. "Jessica's too. They just didn't want you to know." The sound that followed was not gasping. It was worse. It was the stillness of 70 people pretending they weren't witnessing the collapse of a curated narrative. Andrea blinked. What? Jessica stood, knocking her chair back with a jolt. "You weren't even invited." I didn't flinch. I was. My mother's voice came softly, but it reached all corners. "I sent the invitation. I wanted her here." Andrea stared at me like I had turned into a stranger. "But Caleb said, he said you had a breakdown, that you dropped out of med school, that you left." Caleb's face went pale. I looked at Andrea, then at the table, then back up. "I didn't vanish, Andrea. They just stopped looking." Jessica took a sharp step forward, but our mother touched her arm. Jessica shook it off, not meeting my eyes. Andrea put her glass down carefully. The stem clinked against the saucer. "You told me your sister was unstable," she said to Caleb, every word landing with surgical precision. "You never mentioned she became a judge. You let me sit at brunch with her and make small talk like she was a stranger." Caleb opened his mouth, but nothing came. I leaned back slightly, observing the unraveling. Not enjoying it, just witnessing. "You knew," Andrea said to Jessica. "You all knew, and you let me walk into this." "She makes everything about herself," Jessica snapped. "You'll see." "No," Andrea said, eyes narrowing. "What I see is a family that rewrote its own story. You erased her, but she's standing right here." Andrea turned to Caleb. "We need to talk, privately, right now." She didn't wait. She walked out from under the tent and into the cool evening, arms crossed, posture military. Caleb looked at our mother, then at me, then followed. Silence held for another beat. My mother stood, brushed her hands together, and quietly said, "Dessert will be served inside." Chairs scraped, conversations resumed in whispers. The music picked up, now a little too loud. Someone reset the evening like flipping a page. Jessica sat down, still seething. I took a sip of my champagne, finally. It was warm and bitter. Jessica found me alone in the corridor outside the guest rooms. The lights overhead flickered gently, casting a soft yellow glow on the hallway's oak paneling and family portraits, faces staring down, frozen in their preferred version of history. "Was this your plan?" she hissed, stepping close enough for her perfume to crowd the air between us, to humiliate us, to make a scene at Caleb's wedding. I leaned back against the wall, arms folded. I didn't make the scene, Jessica. The truth did. I was just sitting there. Her eyes narrowed. You're always playing the victim. And you're always rewriting the script. I met her glare, unflinching. I didn't come here to cause drama. I came because our mother asked me. I came because I'm tired of pretending I never existed. You walked away, she snapped. You quit. You disappointed everyone. No, I said, voice level. You all decided I was a disappointment the moment I didn't become a carbon copy of the rest of you. I didn't walk away. I was pushed. The silence that followed was brittle. She scoffed and shook her head, heels clicking as she turned. You always make everything complicated. I thought of Caleb's voice from years ago, saying the exact same thing. Back then, I'd believed him. Thought maybe it was my fault for not fitting the mold. Now, I knew better. Back in my room, I sat at the desk and pulled out my grandfather's letter once again. The paper had grown soft from being unfolded so many times, the ink slightly smudged at the corners. I ran my finger along the familiar words. Some cages are lined with gold, Monica. You were born to break them. He always saw me for who I really was, even when no one else did. A soft knock came at the door. I opened it to find Caleb standing there, hands shoved deep in his pockets, tie half loosened, the polished veneer cracking. I'm not here to argue, he said. Can I sit? I nodded. He took the edge of the window seat, shoulders hunched forward like he was bracing for impact. I wanted to say I'm sorry, he began. I lied to Andrea. I didn't tell her about you, not really. I told her you left medicine, but I didn't tell her why, or what you've done since. Why not? I asked. He rubbed his hands together. Because I didn't know how to explain you, and I didn't want her to ask questions I couldn't answer. I exhaled slowly. Then maybe you didn't really know me at all. He winced. Maybe not. I guess I only knew the version of you that made sense inside our family's narrow definition of success. I'm sorry I let that version stick. I studied him for a moment. For the first time in a long while, Caleb looked less like the golden child and more like the brother I used to build pillow forts with on rainy Saturdays. You still have time to get to know the real one, I said. He gave a tight nod, stood, and left the door open behind him as he went. The morning after brunch was sparsely attended. People kept their voices low, eyes flicking sideways, pretending nothing had happened. The buffet was elaborate. Quiches, fresh berries, artisan breads, but few touched their plates. I said little, just smiled when appropriate and refilled my coffee twice more than I needed to. As I stepped out into the garden for air, Andrea approached from the opposite path. She looked calm, more composed than I would have expected from someone who'd just watched her wedding crumble in real time. I called it off, she said quietly. I nodded. I figured. She glanced around at the trimmed hedges and rose bushes, then back at me. It wasn't just about the lie. It was what it said about the kind of man he is. If he could pretend his sister didn't exist, what else could he pretend? I stayed silent, letting her have the space. I didn't want to marry a man who's afraid of the truth, she added, especially not when the truth is someone like you. That hit me harder than I expected. Thank you, I said, voice tight. She stepped closer, voice dropping. You deserve better than silence, Monica, and so do I. Then she hugged me, briefly, firmly, no theatrics, just mutual respect wrapped in quiet pain. Back in my room, I began to pack. The suitcase clicked shut with a quiet finality that felt satisfying. My phone buzzed just as I was tucking the last blouse into place. Unknown number. This is Judge Reid, I answered. A professional voice replied, Judge Reid, this is the governor's office. We're calling to let you know you've been shortlisted for the open seat on the state Supreme Court. I sat on the bed. Thank you. You'll receive a formal notification next week. Congratulations, ma'am." The call ended. I stared at the phone in my lap. A year ago, I would have called Maya immediately, but in this moment, I just let it settle. Let the quiet do its work. I was proud. A knock came again, this time brisk. I opened the door to find Jessica walking past. She didn't stop, didn't even look at me. "You'll always be a disgrace to me," she said as she swept by, her voice sharp but hollow. I smiled softly to myself. "Luckily," I called after her, not unkindly, "I don't need your permission to be proud." She didn't respond, and I didn't need her to. A year later, I stood on the marble steps of the Virginia Supreme Court, the robe hanging from my shoulders like quiet armor. The May morning sun cast long, respectful shadows across the white stone. My name was etched on the bronze plaque just outside the building. No title from birthright, no family legacy. Just me, Monica W. Reid. The W stood for William, a silent tribute. Inside the courtroom, the governor handed me the final document of appointment with a confident smile. "You don't need a dynasty behind you, Judge Reid," he said as we shook hands. "You're building your own." The audience clapped. Colleagues, clerks, former clients. From the second row, my mother sat in a powder blue suit, clapping softly, eyes glossy. She hadn't asked to sit in the front, though she could have. When our eyes met, she gave a gentle nod. It was enough. After the ceremony, she waited until the others had cleared before approaching. For a long second, neither of us said anything. Then she reached out, pulled me into a brief but firm hug, and whispered, "I've read every ruling." Clipped the articles. "I even watched your interview on PBS." A soft smile. "Your grandfather would have been proud." I nodded, feeling that familiar lump rise in my throat. "You can be proud too, you know." She looked down, then back up. "I am. Quietly, maybe, but deeply." We said our goodbyes with small smiles and unsaid things, but some truths no longer needed to be spoken to be felt. Back in my new office, a corner chamber with tall windows and clean white walls, I set down a single photo on the desk. Me and Grandfather William at my law school graduation, the sun in our eyes and his arms strong around my shoulders. I added the pocket watch next to it, still ticking. I hadn't worn it to the ceremony. It wasn't for display. It was for grounding. The office smelled faintly of leather and lemon oil, a blank slate, like everything I'd worked for, earned, not inherited. That weekend, I drove up the winding road to the cemetery. The grass was bright green, thick with spring growth. I knelt beside the headstone, William Reid on 32 to 2018. Some bridges burn themselves. Let them. I brushed a few pine needles aside, then pulled the swearing-in photo from my coat pocket and set it gently against the stone. Next to it, I laid the pocket watch. "I didn't prove them wrong," I said, barely above a whisper. "I proved you right." The breeze shifted, and the wind carried the faint scent of honeysuckle from somewhere down the hill. I sat there a while, letting the silence affirm what words never could. Sunday afternoon brought our standing ritual, coffee with Caleb, same shop, same corner table. He arrived late, apologizing, a little breathless. "Clinic ran over," he explained, dropping into the seat across from me. "We're short volunteers this month." He now split his time between his private practice and part-time work at the legal aid clinic downtown. Not a complete reinvention, but a gentle rebalancing. "I read your opinion in the Garrison housing case," he said, sipping his black coffee. "Solid work." "Thanks," I said, stirring in a bit of cream. "Andrea's nonprofit cited it in their brief." His eyebrows lifted slightly. "She told me, said whoever helped fund the startup made sure the first 3 years were covered." I didn't say anything. He didn't press. We talked about cases, about policy changes, about how the coffee at the shop had gotten marginally better since switching roasters. The kind of siblinghood I'd always hoped for. Not loud or dramatic, but steady. Simple. Jessica hadn't been in touch. I didn't expect her to be. And I didn't need her permission anymore to feel whole. Some people cling to their versions of truth until it hardens them. Others grow. I had grown. That was enough. As I left the coffee shop and stepped into the quiet streets, I felt it again. That strange, satisfying weight of peace. Not the kind that comes from applause or from being proven right or from any one moment, but the kind that settles when you've stopped chasing what never needed to be chased. I walked slowly down the sidewalk, tea in hand, toward the Capitol Dome, just visible beyond the trees. I wasn't walking away from anything anymore. I was simply walking forward, and that, finally, was mine to choose. There was no grand applause when I walked away from my grandfather's grave, only the quiet satisfaction of knowing I had become exactly who he believed I could be. Sometimes, the peace we find isn't in being welcomed back. It's in knowing we never truly needed the door to open again. In life, family may forget your name, but they can never erase your worth. When we choose integrity over approval, we begin writing a legacy that doesn't ask for permission. And perhaps the most courageous act is to love yourself when no one else knows how. If this story reminded you of a truth you've carried or a silence you've survived, I'd love to hear what stayed with you. Feel free to share your thoughts or simply take this story with you, like a letter finally opened.